California Senator Josh Newman joins us to discuss the state's housing crisis. With a population of over 39 million, California has some of the highest housing costs in the nation, making affordability a major challenge. Senator Newman highlights the regulations, market forces, and political obstacles that have contributed to the crisis and some of the steps that are being taken to change the tide for home buyers.
Our state government has taken a very kind of proactive approach in trying to create funding and opportunities for people at the bottom of the income scale. And what that has done is created a bunch of friction kind of within the market. But how do we create, in our case, like millions of new units as quickly as possibly, as affordable as possible? But then there's the different question about where would they be? You can't create more land, so you're going to have to create more housing on the existing amount of land. And so to do that, again, not a simple thing, but until we do it, we're going to continue facing some real challenges, especially as it relates to the next generation.
So welcome everybody today to the Construction Lending Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Ferris with Land Gorilla. And today we have a very special guest, very exciting guest to have on the podcast today. We have Senator of California, Josh Newman, and he's representing Senate District 29. Josh, I can't say how much and how excited I am to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm that special, but I'm grateful for the invitation. So looking forward to the conversation.
Well, this is, an interesting podcast because, we're always diving into, construction and construction financing and, how to make things faster, safer, more efficient. But housing comes up so much and the challenges in the industry, and states manage their, housing issues, dramatically different from state to state, and different policies and, different cultures. When I think of California, growing up in California, affordable housing in general, just as part of my DNA personally, something that, I've followed very closely, since before I could even vote. So when I think about all the issues, California has, and California, huge state, we're so different from the inland to the coast, top to bottom. It's really like a bunch of states put together. But we have these housing issues, affordability. We have a lot of regulation, cost to build, lot development. What's the right solution out there? And everybody kind of looks at California as as a great example of, options that are, options is the wrong word, about, a state that's kind of struggling to provide affordable housing to its residents. So having you on here, I'd love to get your perspective on it. I hope we just dive right on in, but and maybe we start with that is, how do you vision, or how do you see the state's housing crisis?
Okay, so we're really just diving in. That's awesome. California, largest state in the nation, a population of well over 39 million, and has this wonderful history as a destination for, people from all over, from within the U.S., but from all over the world, coming to pursue their dreams. And for most of California's history, we had an abundance of land. Everybody who lives in California has heard a story about somebody's grandparents who came to a wonderful place like Santa Monica and bought a lot or a house next to the ocean for like $12,000. And the world over time, fills itself in. And so California no longer has that privilege, that bounty. And that house in Santa Monica now that somebody's grandparents bought and built for some very small amount of money, even in that day, right? Even when you account for inflation, that place is worth $6 million now. And the other thing that has changed over the last couple of decades is capital flows frictionlessly, throughout the world. And so, very quickly, supply and demand, match up in ways that weren't this way at all, in 1950s, say. So California right now has some of the highest median home prices in the nation. And we have a real mismatch between families' earning potential and the cost of housing, and also the cost of the development of new housing. And so, this is a problem that state government in California has been grappling with for a long time. And frankly, we haven't made nearly enough progress. I live in Orange County. Median home price in Orange County is north of $1 million now, where median income is nothing like that, right? So a 2-earner family has to earn about $480,000 a year right now to afford a down payment and then sort of the mortgage service on a house. That's a really daunting prospect, and so that's kind of where I join you today in talking about housing in California. And so the question moving forward is how do we alter those two curves, supply and demand, so that we can push down the cost of housing? The only obvious way to do that is to create more of it. And the challenge in California is how do you do that against, as you mentioned, a very complicated regulatory system, but also against really powerful market forces, and also the politics of housing, right, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. So that's kind of where we are, and not a simple thing by any means. But we're not different, I think, in that regard than lots of other places.
Well, how did here's a good because people are going to be listening to this podcast from just about every state. How is California different than other states? Help them understand what makes California unique in a situation where it may be more difficult in California to solve this problem than, say, Texas.
So I can think of sort of quickly 3 different ways. One is California has a set of sort of governing features that are probably very different than other states. So we have as a feature of our revenue system something called Prop 13 in the late 1970s. There was what was described as a tax revolt, right? As taxes were going up. This is during kind of the Reagan era. President Reagan was, before that, he was governor of California. So there was a guy named Howard Jarvis who led kind of a tax revolt, and they passed, by way of a ballot initiative, a proposition numbered 13 at the time that restricts how much you can raise property taxes on a piece of land and year to year, and because of that, Californians who own property for a long time pay much lower tax rates than people who bought it recently, and it also limits how much money is available to the state by way of property taxes to make investments in things like affordable housing. Secondly, we have another feature of California, and it's referred to as CEQA by people in the know, but that's short for the California Environmental Quality Act, which was an environmental act passed at about the same time that was intended to make sure that any development was sort of consistent with treating the environment well. That was the intention, but over time that has become CEQA has become kind of a lever and an impediment to development, in that anybody can sue anybody from anywhere. And the net result of that is it makes developing land and building in California much more expensive than it otherwise would be when you incur sort of prospective litigation, the environmental impact reports, all the kind of armies of consultants that are now necessary for that. So even before sticking a shovel in the ground, land in California is much more expensive than in other places. And the third feature, I think, relates to kind of this notion of affordable housing. Our state government has taken a very kind of proactive approach in trying to create funding and opportunities for people at the bottom of the income scale. And what that has done is it's created a bunch of friction kind of within the market. But in the middle of that market, the average Californian, if you're not very wealthy, is really challenged to come up with enough money to purchase property in California. And again, there's probably some similarities in other states, but that's kind of the framework in which this conversation takes place in my state.
Yeah, no, and being from California, quite familiar, but I think it really helps kind of paint a background of, some.
And let me add one more thing, since
Yeah, go for it.
Zoning, right? Again, not too different than other places, but a very prominent feature of California. California is a massive state, right? We have 482 different cities in California, and each of them has its own personality and kind of its own sensibility. And for the most part, the zoning laws in California are geared towards single-family housing, and that creates its own set of challenges, right? So you wind up it's hard to build dense housing in lots of parts of the state which need it. So we've had like a substantial amount of sprawl kind of across the state, and as transportation, energy, the environment have become big concerns. That creates a whole set of dynamics there. And so, that's one of kind of the ongoing conversations within California state government and at the municipal level as well, and often they are at cross purposes, is to what extent do we change that regime so it makes it easier to develop dense housing, smaller footprint housing, but in so doing, it runs the risk of changing the character of a lot of these cities, and frankly, they don't like that. So you wind up with a very sort of polarized environment in which these conversations take place.
So, and there's other communities outside of California that deal with these same situations, but you got your federal level, then you got a pretty hard state level in California, like CEQA you mentioned, and then you really kind of start getting into the community level, right? So the county's going to have their set of rules, and then the city may have their own set of rules on top of that, and then you even may have homeowners associations that layer in that, and each layer of regulation or each layer of requirements adds additional expenses. How much, we kind of have this term that floats around, NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. When we see a lot of these local may be the wrong word, called local regulations, or special zoning requirements, or districts, or special review processes you have to go through. That hurts the availability of housing at the end of the day. You're right. It just adds more friction and more costs that get passed on to the consumer at the end of the day. And this I'm leading us into a conversation towards, what are some of the things that the state's done to help combat that, additional restrictions that start to get added when you get into the local level.
Yeah. Well, let me start. In recent years, in the state capitol, in the legislature, we have run, the legislature has run and passed bills that get at exactly this issue. So, there was a bill, Senate Bill 9 from a couple of years ago, that actually would supersede local zoning and allowed for, by right division of properties up to 4 units, with a bunch of parameters around that. And to your point, a lot of communities didn't like that at all. They really resented being told how they could make decisions, as to how their land could be used, subdivided, and they wound up suing, and it turned out they prevailed quite recently, and so that provision was ruled unconstitutional under California law, and so that conversation continues, and the thing that I think you have to remember if you're a builder or policymaker is new housing is built for people who don't yet live in a community. And right, by definition, if you're going to build 400 units, some of those will be purchased probably by people who already live there, but many from people coming from somewhere else. So they don't have a natural constituency like within a city council, for instance. But the people who do are the people who don't like change, and change is disconcerting for lots of people for lots of reasons, and that's the NIMBY component of that. Even as we in California, will admit. Without a lot of debate, like we need more housing. The question is, who will take the responsibility for it? Who will bear the brunt of it? And that is no small thing at all when you consider, the big cities are mostly fully developed. The smaller communities, in some respects, they're small, by design. That's the way they like it. And then you have the geography problem is in the current economy, especially given some of the pressures around energy and the environment. There's a real move against sprawl in places like California. So, the question is, if you're going to build housing, where, who's going to actually accommodate that effort? And then the biggest question at the end of the day is, how does the market sort of fit into that? Because if at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense for a developer, or if it doesn't make sense for an end consumer, we haven't really gotten very far. And I think that's kind of the riddle of the Sphinx, as it were, in a place like this.
Is the general consensus that the state feels like their hands are almost tied in what they can influence on a local level, or how to provide more affordable housing? Or do you think that, especially when you think about that local versus state,
Right.
conflict? No, hey, you stay out of our community. We want control in our community. Is it a control thing, or does the state feel like, we can only?
So, it depends when you say the state, there's especially like, to whom exactly are you referring? And so there are members of the legislature that are very passionate, in fact, very aggressive about trying to superimpose new approaches that will solve this larger kind of aggregate problem. There are other members of the legislature that have been sent from different parts of the state that are equally, I think, committed to defending the so-called kind of quality of life or character of the communities which they represent. So that's the tension. Even as there are entities within the state, there's a bunch of regional governing organizations. There's the governor's office has a housing department that have been tasked with solving this larger problem. If an economist looks out and says California's population is X, it's growing this fast, our housing demands are such as they are. How do we create in our case like millions of new units as quickly as possibly, as affordable as possible? But then there's the different question about where would they be, and so all this stuff kind of works out in real time, and it becomes really complicated and in many cases very contentious.
What is, what are some of the efforts that you see that are being undertaken to help solve from affordability perspective? It seems like, hey, there's a lot of ideas that are floating around out there, some good, some bad, some could be a pie in the sky pipe dream. What are the ones that really can get legs and run?
So this is a really good question. Especially when you consider the size of California, the size of the market, and kind of the powerful nature of the market forces that come into play. So several years ago, I think it was 2018, 2017, we passed a bill that applies a $75 transaction fee to every commercial real estate transaction in California, and then allocates that money for affordable housing. And it raises, give or take, $200 million a year through that. There were lots of objections, obviously, by the people most affected by it, but it passed. But that $200 million, once applied, actually doesn't really go very far in a state this big, to offset the cost of housing, to bring it down by way of the subsidies that it creates. So we tried that. It was very contentious. It didn't have a big effect. There were a bunch of bills like SB 9 that we've passed and that wind up litigated that don't work. I have my own bill, and I'm sure we'll get to it, which was intended to increase the amount or the pace of and the amount of creation for accessory dwelling units, especially in cities where they're fairly dense. So it's always going to take kind of an all of the above approach that is deliberately kind of pragmatic and iterative. It says, let's across those 482 cities that are so different. What are the different kind of approaches you can take that collectively will start to create housing at a scale that changes the availability and also hopefully pushes down the cost. To be honest, again, work in progress. We haven't really figured it out.
What is speaking of bills, right? We think about affordable housing solutions. You worked really, really hard, and this is the one that got our attention. Is we spent a lot of time talking about ADUs and construction financing, and in that research, we went and discovered 1164. And you were the sponsor of 1164. And, California's kind of been on this path to pave the way to make ADUs a lot easier to build, removing red tape at a local level. I think when we researched it, we found dozens and dozens of different bills and changes and how it's kind of, gained traction and solve this problem, move to the next problem. Okay, now let's get in the way. Now let's try to solve that one. And it keeps like inching its way forward. But it seems to be that there's always something getting in the way of that really taking off and being effective, right? And
so I almost feel like I'm honored to be invited here, but it all feels like a little bait and switch. So as your listeners will soon learn, I had a bill. It was Senate Bill 1164, and the goal of the bill was to try to sort of expedite the creation of accessory dwelling units, in-law units, as they say, by creating an exemption to the property tax that is normally applied, upon the creation and occupancy of an accessory dwelling unit. And it was, honestly, it was my idea. It came to me from a city planner from Anaheim, a super smart guy, from a city where they'd done lots of things to try and streamline, the process for creating ADUs, and they realized the curve wasn't nearly as steep as they'd hoped. And so the thinking there was, if you could reduce the costs associated with, especially the immediate costs upon construction, you would change the math around the construction of that project. People would be more likely to commit to it, to be able to get construction loans to do it. And then over time, if you increased a city's housing stock, you'd get the money back by way of additional revenues later on. And I just thought it was an awesome idea, and it moved kind of halfway through the legislative process on the Senate side. When it got to the Assembly side, it turned out, unbeknownst to me and lots of other people, it was found to be unconstitutional. It ran, kind of headlong into a constitutional feature of our government's Prop 13 that very sort of rigidly dictates how municipalities can handle property taxes and what can or can't be done. So I was really disappointed. I think you folks had already decided, like, you should have that guy on as a guest. And as I was telling you, Sean, as we were coming on, I think it's still relevant. It shows that despite kind of creative approaches, it really is hard to find solutions to these kinds of problems. How do we create more housing in ways that benefit both the market and those who would supply the market?
Yeah, we do the same thing in the sense that, there's obstacles and hurdles and friction points and all these things you have to do to get a construction loan, and working with FHFA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, different government agencies, we're constantly looking at, well, what's getting in the way? Well, why are more people, taking it? Oh, it's this, this, and this. And it sounds like, and then you try to solve those problems. And in this one, it was, people were holding back on adding an ADU because of a new tax assessment. And
Right.
hey, I may have been there for 20 years and I'm paying, Prop 13 taxes from when I bought it 20 years ago, and it would trigger a reassessment of the property. Is that
Well, it would trigger an instant with readjustment, right? It wouldn't assess that Prop 13 part, but all of a sudden, it's $100 for like every new square foot or something like that. I forget but so I create 800 square foot ADU. All of a sudden, I owe $8,000 more in property tax. I can't remember the exact math, but that's daunting for somebody who otherwise has to dip into their equity, secure a construction loan, and then has to think about long term. How do I amortize that investment? So we thought, hey, here's a really clever solution, right? Where you give a little in advance, you create additional housing stock, and so I'm all in to try and find similar approaches. But it maybe it was too good to be true. Turns out it was.
Well, I love ADUs so much because it's almost like this dynamic shift, right? And when we think about the NIMBY persona, right? I don't want that big housing project to go across the street from me and lose my view or have all this added traffic or all the things. So I'm going to be resistant to that. But with an ADU, it kind of puts it back on the individual to make their own improvement, to provide their own solution. Like there's it kind of negates that for them as the individual, and they're able to have a grandmother move in or rent it out, or their kids can stay at home and go to college, whatever that is. They get this control and they get to reap the benefit. And I just love that so much. And I like what we're seeing with ADUs, and it's don't think it's going to get solved tomorrow, but I would love to see more and more of them go in. Are there any other,
Likewise, and so for your listeners, my contribution was actually deliberately on top of a very substantial effort over a number of legislative cycles to try and make it easier, more compelling, and less sort of friction to create ADUs in California, because clearly that's part of a larger solution, especially in urban areas where whether we like it or not, there are families doubled up. Where you got so little room, you got a family living in somebody's garage. So the thing was, let's create a new sort of framework where it makes sense for that family to increase the value of their property, but in so doing, create good livable spaces for other people. And so we've made a little bit of progress, but not nearly enough, again, to meaningful shift the supply and demand curves in those places.
how did you even get involved with this? Did somebody knock on your door and go, "Hey, we got a problem," or is this something that's kind of near and dear to your heart in general?
It's an interesting question. So I represent a bunch of cities, as every state senator does. I have about 1 million constituents, but they fall in 16 different cities in my part of the state. And I think I was on a tour of some in the city of Anaheim. That's where I got the idea from one of their planners. We were on a tour of some motels that would be converted to permanent housing. And then as part of that, we got a kind of a larger briefing on some of the efforts that Anaheim was applying into trying to expedite, the ADU creation process. And so one of the things they've done in Anaheim was they've created a set of standardized plans that are, this whole series of them that might be a good fit for a homeowner, but that are already pre-approved, right? So you don't have to take them in. And so they had compacted the sort of the permitting and approval process from normally what is weeks to literally like 24 hours, because you're getting a template that's already approved, which is smart. And so the guy who did that, what?
That's genius.
Genius. And it's especially smart if different cities can share designs and get to a place where, depending on my property, there's an approved plan already in place for something that's attractive, useful, affordable. So I gave credit where credit is due. To the planner, I was like, that's really smart. And what other things are you doing? And that's when he said, hey, we think, or I guess he thought, and I gave him credit for the insight, was that's not all of it. Part of it is the perceived cost of building an ADU. Even when you created this, this kind of templatized approach, you still have this problem of the kinds of people who own properties for which ADUs would be good, good additions. They're not rich, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have somebody living in their garage. But if we could create a scenario where they could, it made more sense, where it was more appealing, and where the math was more obviously in their favor, wouldn't that be great? So that's where he said to me, like, I have this idea, right? Why don't we exempt for 5-7 years, the additional tax increment that somebody would otherwise accrue in building an ADU, so that they would be incentivized to do this. And I'm not that smart. I'm just smart enough to know when somebody else has a good idea. And I said, that's a cool idea. Let's see if we can't do a bill. And as I mentioned, the first half, a bill has to make it through both chambers. It goes through, probably 2 committee hearings in both of the relevant agencies, housing, governmental operations, stuff like that. And on the Senate side, everybody had to admit, even, the people that didn't really love the idea, admit, like, that's a good creative idea. Maybe it works. And again, then we got to the assembly side, and they were like, hold your horses. That's, a great idea. As we used to say in the military, like, good initiative, bad judgment. They're like, it's not going to work. Unfortunately, right? Because I bet you in some other state, I bet you it works really well. But by virtue of our Constitution, apparently that doesn't jibe.
Shane, where do we go from here? Or should I say, where are you going to go from here? 1164, is it going to have a reincarnation, or?
I tried really hard to, like, what's the workaround? What can we do by way of offsets where, if there's a constitutional issue here, we can probably offset it somewhere else. Like, could we give a tax credit in response, to the tax obligation, right? So you're not waiving something that's outside of our purview as the legislature. And we've got a challenging budget environment right now in California, so there wasn't any support for that. So I'm not really sure, except that I'm generally convinced, like, if you give creative people, knowledgeable creative people, a chance to help solve a problem, you'll be surprised by the kinds of ideas that they bring to the conversation. And I think that's what the fellow from Anaheim was doing. So part of my job is hopefully to go find good ideas that solve problems like this.
Speaking of good ideas, how what's the best way to get these ideas to come forward? Is there some sort of annual summit you can go to and say, hey, I got this idea, or you just gotta call somebody like you and get them excited about it?
That is an interesting question. So there are a bunch of associations in California that they all have a shared kind of interest in solving these problems. So, and they typically have good advocates, and they have conferences and stuff. So maybe that's a good venue for that. But one of the things that I think people don't realize is California, for being so large, actually has a very small legislature, especially proportional to our population. And it's pretty accessible, right? So in the same way that Ted White from Anaheim, he and I had a conversation. I and I hope others would welcome those kinds of ideas, either from stakeholders or advocates or from individuals that have identified the problem and think they might have a solution. Some of my best legislation has come from precisely those kinds of conversations.
But what else do you know, kind of as we think about other avenues to increase the housing supply in California? What other efforts are you seeing, out there aside from the ADU conversation to help accelerate the availability for housing or provide affordable housing? And with that response, when we talk about affordable housing, I always like to know, are we talking about multifamily? Are we talking about single family? Like, when we say affordable housing, what is that?
Well, in California, I think it's also important that when we use the term affordable, that's both a sort of a typical descriptor, right, an adjective, but it's also a technical term, right? Affordable housing in California typically means subsidized housing, right, where there is some level of subsidy associated with the housing created that makes it accessible, affordable to a lower income purchaser. But that's only because we've added rules or dynamics so that it's there's a subsidy associated with it. Where the average person is involved, affordable means within my means, and again, that's gotten harder and harder in California. And so the question is like, how do we do that? And in a state this big, as diverse, with as many local jurisdictions as there are, I've come to believe the way you do that is by creating incentives that hopefully unleash some level of creativity where it's worth it for medium-sized cities, right, to say like, hey, this is interesting. We can see this fitting into our kind of broader plans and our sort of politics, if you will, because it makes sense, right? It either makes sense by way of our kind of long-term plans, or it makes sense because there's an incentive associated with it that helps us solve other problems. And without getting too in the weeds here, let me refer to something you may know a little bit about, Sean. In California, we have something called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment process, where every 6 years on a cycle, a city is required to look at their geography and identify a discrete number of properties that they could build a specific number of housing units on. It's required by law. But the problem with that is simply identifying places where you could build doesn't mean you will build. And so despite this process being in place for 50 years, it typically comes up short every year because, just because a city says, there's a parcel here that could be developed doesn't mean a developer, it makes sense to them. The penciling out doesn't always lead to its development. And so, but that RHNA, as they call it, RHNA is referred to RHNA here, that regime actually creates a bunch of negative incentives. There's a bunch of lawsuits going on between the state, the governor, the administration, and cities that haven't conformed to the requirements or met their obligations. And so I personally believe we have to take a different approach, is we have to create additional positive incentives where you'd say to, cities, say like, hey, if you create X number of housing units, you'll get some additional increment of general fund monies, for instance, to solve some of your other problems, right? Public safety, pension, infrastructure, whatever. And if you could do that, if we did that, I think there'd be no shortage of interested applicants. Again, within 482 cities, there's probably 14 in California that are really, truly big. There's probably 200 that are so small, that they're not going to move the needle. But in the middle, there's at least 100 medium-sized cities. If you could get those 100 cities really creatively working at rezoning their jurisdictions, figuring out ways to reduce permitting costs, application fees, expedite timelines, you would see no shortage of activity in ways that we would, I think, be pleasantly surprised by. And if we did that, and I think we should do that, then we'd start to come up with models in the same way that I think my friend Ted in Anaheim thought he had a good one, that over time will get us to where we want to go. But it certainly doesn't work very well, kind of, as top down, as we've been trying.
Yeah, I would apply the carrot versus stick analogy, right? Seems like we have a whole lot of stick. Stick has not worked really well in the past. And it seems like a lot of lawsuits come from sticks. And, shifting to an incentive-based, kind of solution, like, hey, you do it, we'll reward you. How significant do you think those rewards would have to be for communities to change zoning?
I'm not sure they have to be that significant. I think you have to change, recalibrate the conversations that sort of changes the orientation, right? And so, think about this, right? So if you live in a medium-sized city, you've got a city council, it's five, sort of well-intentioned people that in California make no money doing it, and that have sort of a limited amount of power, and typically somebody's the mayor for 1 year and it rotates. And so, the question is like, how can you get them interested enough to really think hard and then push hard and push city manager, planning departments, engineering departments to do these things? And I think not huge amounts of money at all would do that. Like, if I, as a city council member, could get additional monies to increase the size of my police force, I'd be pretty powerfully incentivized to do that. And as a result, I'd be really open to, I think, creative ideas to do that.
So it could come in from not just housing incentives and money for housing, but hey, exactly. Roads, police, fire, education.
Totally, because what we're really talking about is what does it take to change the mindset in a medium-sized community about development, right? And so because the default right now is, I got a developer comes in and says like, there's an old unused piece of property, I want to put 1,800 units there, which is a lot, but it's probably a small fraction of that city's obligation under kind of that housing needs process. And the minute you say that, there's a whole bunch of people that say like, that's terrible, right? That's awful. That, that's going to cause congestion. It's going to change the character of our neighborhoods. It's going to impact our schools, blah, blah, blah. And then that city council person says, oh, you're right. That's a terrible idea. But if that city council person had an incentive that said, hey, listen, if we can do this, we can also improve our roads, enlarge the size of a fire department, et cetera, they'd have something to counter with. And I think they'd be far more inclined to work deliberately and creatively to get that done. That's my theory.
Yeah, no, I mean, why not? I think at this point, everything should be on the
right. But by the way, I mean, that's where good ideas go to die, right? And as all your listeners know, at the local planning department, right, at the hearing, where the developer comes in and maybe he's got some prospective buyers that say like, hey, I'd love to live in this community, but I can't afford it. I will if this is built. And then the rest of the chamber is full of angry people that are just shocked and offended that somebody would dare to change the character of their neighborhood.
Oh, great question, and it's something that I am conflicted with a lot. My wife and I, we're fortunate enough to have purchased a home at the right time in our community. Otherwise, we would never have been able to be here. And I think about affordable housing programs and the different incentives and different programs that are out there. And the consequences of that is, hey, so at the end of the day, somebody pays for it. And you made a great comment about it being subsidized, and that's very, very true when we think about like government, affordability programs, because it's some, that developer is just going to raise the price on the other 10 homes that they're building. And, hey, this one's going down, these are going to go up. So we're just going to make it harder for this group over here, but a financial incentive for this group. We're going to raise the bar and lower the bar here. Somebody's got to pay.
Right.
Why is it important, me personally, I'm asking the question, why is it important that we have these programs that we try really hard? I've already got my house. I worked hard. Why do we have to care about this?
I think, that's a very good question. I mean, it's a good, thoughtful question. And I think, let me like zoom back a little bit. I think, in California, what we've seen over the last decade or more is we've seen the share of Californians who are owners versus renters steadily decrease. And, there is a balance that I think is important in sort of, that sort of binary question, which is renting versus owning. If you own and you pay property taxes and you pay school taxes, you have a different relationship to local and state government, right? To kind of the broader kind of fabric than somebody who rents. If I rent, I'm probably in some ways offsetting my landlord's costs, but I don't really have the same relationship to my city and to kind of civic processes, and that's very kind of nuanced, but I think it's important. And then I think the other question that, is how do we then create opportunities for people to buy into what we all assume is kind of intrinsic to the American experience, the so-called American dream, the opportunity to own your own home, own your, and it doesn't have to be, probably can't be forever, the 3-bedroom home with 2 baths and a picket fence and all that stuff. There's just not enough land, but it's owning something, right? And the best way to create intergenerational wealth in America is through property ownership, right? It's through the equity that accrues to somebody by owning a house. If you're a renter, you pay over time the exact same amount of money that I might as a mortgage holder, but I'm accruing equity. You're getting nothing. And so I think, it's very generally speaking, is we're trying to level the playing field in some ways. But it is important to realize, like to your point, that subsidized unit is paid for by somebody. It's also not available to everybody, right? Somebody gets lucky, right, or has the good fortune of acquiring that property. Somebody else offsets that cost. In the middle, quite often, are people who get stuck in between, who can either qualify for the subsidized unit, but also can't afford the unsubsidized unit. And I worry about that middle. That is in effect the middle class in California and so many other places. So the only way to change that is to deliberately increase the amount of housing to decrease the cost relative to people's resources and income potential. And the only way to do that is to strip out a whole bunch of the friction, right? In the regulation to do that. And at some point, I think in California, we're going to have to do that.
Yeah, no, and I'm not, a big cynic over here that doesn't see the value of having affordable housing, and
nor am I, but I think it's really important. And again, language matters. When my colleagues and I talk about affordable housing, I think it would be more honestly, to call that subsidized housing, right? Because call it what it really is. And then because to a middle class person, they think, oh, that's awesome. There's a unit going, development going in with affordable housing. And it turns out like you don't qualify. So truly affordable housing means, the market actually dictates and people, and it meets people's needs in ways that we really, we did remarkably well post-World War II. All that housing development, all, federal housing, it's all that stuff. We created opportunities for people to own. They are very fortunate, right? Their kids have enjoyed that good fortune. How do we do that for the next generation? How do we do that in a place in California where if I have a little town, Walnut Hill, through Walnut, in my district, if you own a place there, you're lucky. But if your kids want to graduate college and move there, they can't afford anything. And the zoning doesn't really allow for a lot of apartments either. So what do you do? All right, what do you do? And so I think parents are really concerned that, that dream of having your kids own a home, have their kids like you within comfortable reach, that goes away. And for the kids, this is the conversation I think that's happening in California. Like, where do I go? Where do I go where I can have the same sort of earning potential and experience that my parents and grandparents did? And too often, the thinking is now it's some other state, right? It pains me as a legislature. Is it Arizona? Is it Texas? That's too bad. I mean, that says something really alarming about the trajectory for California.
Yeah, no, I always think about our kids, and I think about the people who work at Langrilla, and it's exciting to watch them obtain a home, and I think I understand the need for some of these programs, but raising that bar can push them out, and I think it's a fair balance. You mentioned regulation there. We can end on this last question here with regulation. Why does it, if it's so important to the state, why don't they just start pulling regulation back? Why don't they change? If it's that important, why don't they just kind of get in the way of, hey, we're going to remove this, and sequel, we're going to take another look at that. What's the
I think we've seen recent evidence that it's not easy, right? So the legislation that I mentioned, which allowed for by right subdivision, of properties, was a really contentious discussion. It eventually got passed, signed by the governor. Then it turned out it was so unattractive to a bunch of municipalities that they sued, and it turns out they prevailed. So that's hard. On CEQA, the Environmental Quality Act, again, it was developed in the 70s, well-intentioned, but it creates this sort of downward pull, increased cost. And we typically, as a legislature, like we make waivers of that act, all the time. Specific development of a stadium for the reconstruction of our capital, which is being renovated. But if you're going to do this statewide, that turns out to be really challenging, right? Because there's a whole bunch of people with kind of a vested interest in the CEQA process that are going to fight really hard if we try to relax that. And some of whom I think have pretty compelling cases, like about the environment. And so this is our challenge in California. Having a balance between our values, as we say. The environment matters. Sort of egalitarianism matters. Equitable treatment matters. But we also have to allow that market forces matter. They probably matter more than anything. And so until we come to terms with that, and especially given kind of sort of changes in the world where there is money everywhere, and so there are no shortage of investors for land, especially in a place like California. And here's the thing: you can't create more land, so you're going to have to create more housing on the existing amount of land. And so to do that, again, not a simple thing, but until we do it, we're gonna continue facing some real challenges, especially as it relates to the next generation and their ability to do what every American has always assumed is kind of their birthright, which is buy a house, live with your family in a place that you love to be. So I hate to end. I feel like I'm ending on a really sour note.
No. It's
to your listeners, like, oh, that guy bummed me out. Yeah.
I love this conversation because it's so real, and it's I almost feel selfish in this podcast that it's me getting to ask all these great questions about housing in California. We usually end with kind of this lightning round where I ask you some questions, and I'll pull one question out from the lightning round because I think it's super relevant. But if you were able to just snap your fingers and make one change to solve this problem, what would it be?
I think I was headed in that direction. I would have a CEQA holiday in California. I would relax in a really meaningful way the Environmental Quality Act until such time as we had caught up on some of our housing deficits. And I think there are lots of safeguards within that. You've got, we've got inspection processes, permitting processes that can ensure that, that buildings are safe, that they're done in ways that don't adversely affect other people. But it would materially reduce the cost of development. It would substantially increase the pace of development. And then, let's have a CEQA holiday until the market starts to look a little bit more right size as it relates to supply and demand and cost affordability.
Can we make that into a bill?
No way. Not a chance. Well, let me say not by a single legislator, but I will say, if there is a governor in the next couple of cycles in California who's willing to do that, I think there's support for it. But no one member of the legislature is going to be able to pull this off. It will take a governor.
We get CEQA holiday. We get exemptions for government buildings. We get exemptions for the big stadiums that go in, but we don't get exemptions for the people that want to build a house.
I can't defend it, but I think you've properly described it.
Yeah. So, hey, we're going to apply that same, that would be amazing. Absolutely amazing. I'm sorry to be a little cynical in that example, but
it's not, I don't think it sounds cynical at all. That's realism. That's the truth. You asked, what's the single thing we could do? I think, to my mind, that's it.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. If people want to get in touch with you, learn a little bit more, they have this brilliant idea, whatever it is, what's the best way for them to get in contact with your office?
You can reach me really easy. I'm going to give you my email, and it's really easy to write down. So josh.newman, Newman, at sen.ca.gov, right? So Senate California. So josh.newman at sen.ca.gov. That will come directly to me.
That's amazing. Senator, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Hope to have you back soon. This was absolutely amazing. Thank you enough.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. Land Gorilla Inc. makes no representations, warranties, or promises for and disclaims any express or implied warranties related to content. Before acting on any information, you should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to your unique business needs.